I know there are people of various political views watching tonight, and I want you to know I promise to be a president for all Americans. You can always trust me to put country above party and self.
You are listening to Vice President Kamala Harris as she accepted the Democratic nomination for president at the convention in Chicago last week. So what is this new way forward she's talking about? When will the honeymoon of early support for the Harris-Walz ticket start to fade? And how does the state of Washington play into Harris's aim to change the power dynamic in our nation's capital? Well, some big questions this week on a special Patrons First episode of Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine. And the reason this episode is so special is I have a special guest, and that would be Scott Greenstone from KUOW, co-host of the Sound Politics podcast. Just got home from the convention actually a few days ago. Scott, would you say you are exhausted or completely exhausted? Please.
Is there one further? There's got to be I slept for 12 hours and then woke up and forgot where I am on Friday morning.
I love it. I love it. That was some hard work out there. We're going to dive into it. I really appreciate you being with me, Scott. Thank you for doing this. Thank you also to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast on the first floor of City Hall. And a special thanks to our show patrons. Hope you are enjoying this Patrons First podcast this week. I'll be discussing a patron's question on the show next week. Those just a few of the bonuses for becoming a patron. Check it out on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Thanks also to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast airs on Converge most often Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. All right, let's get the party started with right here, right now. Scott, I just wanted to get some perspective on what the convention was like. We saw the speeches. We saw Coach Walz's football team. We saw Lil Jon helping out with the roll call for Georgia. Okay. I just wanted to ask what stood out to you the most about the DNC. What were your overall impressions other than Lil Jon impressions? Because I already handled that. What do you got?
You have it totally handled. You know, it's funny. My co-host on Sound Politics, Libby Denkman, we don't like to hate on Macklemore too much because, you know, a lot of people like Macklemore. But I will say Macklemore was our Lil Jon was our music while we cast, you know, while the Washington State Democrats cast their vote for Kamala Harris. And I just have to. I just have to say, like, there's gotta be something else we could do. I don't know, you know, Heart. We could do. I mean, is there a Nirvana song that gets people pumped? It doesn't have to be something in the way. But yeah, I will say that the vibe shift that I saw last week in Chicago, particularly if you consider the vibes of the Washington State Democrats convention in Bellevue in June, which I also went to. The shift between the two of those was huge. In June, in Bellevue, again for the state convention, Democrats still had Joe Biden as the nominee. The debate had not yet happened, if I remember correctly, but the vibe was really anxious. There was a lot of talk about, we could lose this. Bob Ferguson, the candidate for governor of Washington, came up on stage and said, Donald Trump could win in November and my race could be close, which is... Washington hasn't elected a Republican to the governor's mansion since the 80s. So it was shocking to me to see them kind of spreading this like doom and gloom, sort of like democracy is in the balance talk.
Yep.
And the change between Bellevue in June and last week in Chicago from the state delegation and across, you know, from delegations across the country was very surprising, right? I talked to delegates. They feel much better about Vice President Harris's chances of getting people up off the couch. You know, these folks are Democrat super fans, right? They would have been here if it had been Biden, right? Probably most of them. But they feel better about their chances or about Kamala Harris's chances of getting people to show up and vote.
And let me talk a little bit more about that delegation from Washington, because I read in the Seattle Times that many people were warning against complacency, hearkening back to 2016 when Hillary Clinton held such a big lead over Donald Trump in the pre-election polling. I just wanted that overall take, and you're kind of going down this path here, Scott, but the Washington delegation, cowboy hats and all, and maybe some of those uncommitted delegates too. What was that scene like among those delegates?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the uncommitted delegates. It was a largely positive and then in some places mixed vibe from the delegation. I mean, yes, people feel more confident about Vice President Harris's chances to, beat Donald Trump in November. At the same time, there are folks, especially from Seattle and Western Washington, who want to see Harris differentiate herself from Biden, particularly on several issues, but particularly on the issue of Israel and Gaza. I mean, if you live in Seattle, you've seen the protests that have kind of rocked the city over the last 10 months since October 7th. So basically, back in March, right, a number of Democrats in the state, about 10%, voted uncommitted rather than vote for Joe Biden. That sent 2 uncommitted delegates to Chicago. And they were joined by some allies among the Biden-Harris delegates who were there, who said, hey, look, we need to see something different from Vice President Harris. And they were a little bit disappointed, I think, in the proceedings. They wanted a Palestinian speaker. They didn't get that to address the convention. A lot of so there was a mix of good vibes from most of the convention, but some other folks were like, these are just the same words that we're hearing from Vice President Harris, and we've heard the same words in the last 10 months. This is no change, no shift.
Interesting, and I'm going to dive into that a little bit more later in the podcast.
Sure.
But I did want to talk a little bit more about kind of these overall impressions here, because I guess beyond that Gaza issue, that's definitely something that the Harris campaign is going to have to focus on. But just looking at this outreach that I saw during this convention, trying to gather in the swing voters, Republicans who might be looking for other options, independents out there. We heard from Melania Trump's former aide. There was former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger, even Oprah Winfrey, who described herself as a, quote, registered independent voter, speaking out too. I just wanted to talk about what you made of that focus. And do you think those efforts will be successful? Some thoughts about that.
That's a good question. It made me think of one of our local Republicans for Harris, Chris Vance, who used to be the chair of our state party.
Former state GOP chair, right.
Yeah, and it made me wonder, some of my family members are former Republicans who are certainly kind of drawn in by that. But, it's unclear. Republicans are also trying to paint Harris as kind of this leftist at times in the past. She's supported Medicare for all, or things that Bernie Sanders supported. She does come from California. I really did feel like she was trying to go strong on the moderate. Let's really reach out to the moderate American. Let's I don't know, get away from whatever you think of this narrative, but get away from the coastal elite and the chance
comrade Kamala thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the chance Trump, of USA, those were. I was surprised how much I heard USA, especially considering that Democrats overall, the polling shows that they don't think that America is the best country in the world, and so there was a lot of showing out for that, and I thought that was interesting.
Taking back patriotism or something. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think some of those ads they do seem pretty compelling, but is that gonna work? It's unclear to me. I mean, not to go back to the uncommitted folks, but they say what you need to do is actually win over voters in Michigan, for instance. A lot of Muslim voters, they said that they weren't going to vote for Biden because of his stance on Israel and arming Israel. So I don't know. There's a question there. Do you go to the left? Do you go to the right? Do you try and hew down the middle? Or people much smarter than me probably have much better answers to whether or not that's going to work.
I hear what you're saying, though, because it's at least forecast from the Harris campaign to be one of these closer races, even though we have seen this polling really jump in the past couple of weeks here. I think what they're seeing here is something where we could be looking at a very, very close election. So all of those voters, that moderate path she's taking is important there. But I guess in the same breath, I've got to say in the state of Wisconsin, they're going to put Jill Stein, the third-party candidate, on the ballot. That could steal a few voters away. I guess, is it that Gaza issue that's going to be that decider in this race?
It's really hard to tell. It's a little bit early to tell. And again, I'm not a big polls guy. I don't love polls in the first place.
Neither do I. I know it's all a horse race after a while, right?
But I will say, and I'll borrow here from the NPR Politics podcast. Harris, since she switched up, early polling shows that she has multiple paths to the presidency. Not all of them go through Michigan, right? And I think that, again, and I'm not a national reporter and I'm not a big polls guy, but I will say that, it seems like polls are showing, this is where the complacency question comes in. Democrats are going to really struggle to keep the Senate. It's looking like it'll go to Republicans, at least from polling now. Democrats keep saying, like, we only have, 70 days, 75 days? I don't really remember. We only have this amount of time, but that is actually a lot of time. And there are a lot of people that decide week of or even sometimes day of. And a lot of those are the swing voters. They just say, I can't stand Trump anymore. I'm going to go vote. Or you know what? Harris is a, communist or whatever. I'm putting myself in their brains.
Sure.
Now, the last thing I want to say, just to bring it back to the Washington State delegation, a lot of those folks are trying to text the people they know in those states. There's a big effort that I saw kind of firsthand. Conventions, of course, national conventions, they're TV shows, but at the same time, they're also a chance for the grassroots, the most committed chunk of the grassroots, to organize and to say, let's send postcards. Let's text people. Maybe I'm going to take a vacation to Arizona and knock some doors in November or in October, right? That's what Washington State is doing.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more to what Washington State is doing, because Washington State could actually play a bigger role than you might think when it comes to this election in November. We're going to break down the only speech given by a Washingtonian during the DNC. Who was that? Find out next on Now Hear This. Here in the state of Washington, you may have been told this vote blue West Coast state doesn't matter that much when it comes to our nationwide election process. But that's where you're wrong. As it turns out, the one and only Washingtonian to gain a coveted speaking role at the DNC last week was Representative Susan DelBene from our state's 1st Congressional District, straight out of Medina, and her position as chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DCCC, has become a lot more interesting. She's making the case that Dems could win the presidency and win a House majority, too, this November.
So let's get out the vote. Let's take back the House. Let's make Hakeem Jeffries our next speaker. And let's send Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to the White House. Thank you.
Scott, I thought this was a really interesting moment for Representative DelBene. As the DCCC chair, she is leading the work essentially on strategy as well as fundraising efforts to win back the House. The Dems need 4 more seats to do that, and she's feeling pretty bullish about that happening. You talked with her. What did she tell you?
I'll give you a small tip. DCCC is way more fun to say than Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee.
I was going with like DCCC or something. Yeah, okay. DCCC. I like it.
DCCC is like, it kind of just rolls off the tongue.
I like it. New band name. Got it. Check. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, the coolest band ever. So Congresswoman DelBene sat down with me Monday on the first day of the convention. And she was wearing this button that said 4 in 24. That is 4 more seats that the Democrats need to win the House majority. That is her goal. She's not really specific about how they get there, probably because she doesn't want to release too many of these secrets, campaign secrets that Republicans, might try to, switch up their strategy to respond to. So what she tends to say is, well, I used to work at Microsoft, or in tech, I'm looking at the data. And then often sort of saying, I'm going to let these members of Congress be themselves, their authentic selves to their district. And what I think about when I hear that, I think about the reason Susan DelBene is chair of the DCCC, which, among other things, is because 2 years ago, she looked down into Vancouver, into Western Washington, and she saw a congressional seat where Jamie Herrera Butler, the incumbent who voted to impeach Trump, was beaten in her primary by a more right-wing, kind of honestly far-right guy named Joe Kent, and that there was a Democrat named Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez. And she saw that Democrat and said, that person has a chance. She kicked her a little bit of money, promoted her some. She was one of the few Democrats to notice that as an opportunity. As we know, if we read, political news, or maybe you don't, Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez won that election in by
2,600 votes, so pretty close,
Very close, but she won it. She's up for re-election again, and she's running against Joe Kent. But, when it comes to, letting these folks be their authentic selves, Susan DelBene often says things like, she's going to criticize Biden. She's going to vote against student loan forgiveness. I mean, Susan doesn't say that, but that's what I think of when she says, let these Democrats be their authentic selves, be Trump country Democrats.
Right. And it's so interesting just because Just looking at Susan DelBene's kind of national profile rise with this is a pretty important position she's in, and she's really been in charge of raising a ton of money. We've talked about all the different dollars coming into the Harris campaign and over the past couple of weeks, but I saw it in the Times, the DCCC raised nearly $1 million in 24 hours after Biden quit the race, and then I think it was somewhere around $17.5 million in July, a total of $107 million this year, which is more than what the National Republican Congressional Committee is doing. I'm just looking at that and what she's talking about with these different Dems. Can they keep that pace up? Because fundraising is going to be a key part of this, as it always is.
Yeah, it's a good question. I tried to get into her donor briefing. No dice. They don't want. Turns out they don't want reporters with mics in the DCCC donor briefing.
Right.
That's a good question. I do think that if they do retake the House, the other connection to Washington State that I'm going to be noticing is that, Adam Smith will take over as chair. Adam Smith is my congressman here in South Seattle. He will take over as chair of the Armed Services Committee. Representative Rick Larson, the Democrat who represents the North Sound up north of us, he'll take over as chair of transportation. So DelBene has been on a, what do you call this? A roller coaster? I don't know about a roller coaster. It seems on an upward trajectory. And it seems like Washington State has as well, because in addition to all those that I mentioned, Senator Patty Murray is now president pro tempore of the Senate, meaning she is third in line to the presidency. So Washington State, after being a little bit of what you might call, backwater might be a little bit too mean of a term.
I know what you're saying, though.
It's gaining some newfound prominence in the Democratic Party, at least.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you bring up these different pieces here to try to regain the House, because I think a lot of people would say the road to victory might even go through the Pacific Northwest. You talked about that race for the 3rd Congressional District with Gluesenkamp-Perez and Kent. And then I know there might be some other red to blue possibilities too. And in Oregon, I saw the Times mention the Democrat Janelle Bynum has a strong challenge for Representative Lori Chavez-DeRemer's job in Oregon's 5th District, kind of from Bend to Portland there. I just wondered, are there other races you're keeping an eye on, Scott, when you look at this?
Yeah, Brian, you said something. The path to the House goes through the PNW. That's something she actually told the Washington State delegation on Monday. You and her are,
simpatico
on the same wavelength. Yeah. But, the other race that I'm looking at that I do think it's worth mentioning, I know we're talking about Democrats because I was at the DNC, right? But I want to talk about Republicans for a moment, because we talked about Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez and the win that she had because of Jamie Herrera Butler's impeachment vote. Over in central Washington, in Yakima, and the district that goes all the way up to Okanogan County, the district that basically stands as a pillar in the center of the state, that is occupied by one of the only other Republicans to vote to impeach Trump who is still in the House, and that is Congressman Dan Newhouse. And he did fine 2 years ago. He beat the Democrat who went up against him. But this time, he's up against a Trump-endorsed Republican named Jared Sessler. Former NASCAR driver. Newhouse is going to have, I think, a hard time. He's not doing great in the primary. Last time I looked, he had about a quarter of the vote. Numbers have probably changed since then, but I think it's worth mentioning that if he gets kicked out, Trump has been trying really hard to kick him out, because it's just him and one other California congressman who voted a part of the so-called impeachment 10. I'll be keeping a close eye on that, because there is just this question of, is this Trump's party now fully? I mean, he's taken over the central apparatus. The RNC was a Trump party. In Washington State, a lot of Republicans aren't big fans of Trump. This is why Republicans have been struggling to win any statewide races since they lost the legislature after Trump was elected in 2016. It's a question here. What's the future of the Republican Party?
Absolutely. That's a great thing to focus on, because I think that race in central Washington is one of them. And I think there will be other races around the country, too, where we could see some flips in Iowa, Alabama, et cetera. So is this still the party of Trump, or is it not? That's a big part of this election, too. Hey, Scott, I did want to touch on one more issue with you briefly here, this idea of disruptions and protests around the DNC. Did you run into former Seattle City Council member Kshama Sawant? She talked about being at the DNC, disrupting the event. I wanted to check on that first.
Yeah, she held an event called Disrupt the DNC with Jill Stein. It was not particularly close to the DNC. I checked, it was about 4 miles away. And so I tried to get time to go check it out, but I did not. get a moment. It's a busy week, and once you leave the area of the DNC, it was hard to get back. The lines to get through the perimeter were incredibly long, and the traffic tended to be pretty rough. However, I did stop by March on the DNC, which was very close to United Center, and that was co-sponsored by Socialist Alternative. And why I bring that up, Councilmember Sawant had a very public split with Socialist Alternative.
That's right.
Very recently. So your readers or your listeners may know that Kshama Sawant was the most public standard bearer of the Socialist Alternative Party, which essentially believes that Democrats, even democratic socialists, are not going far enough, and there needs to be a third party. Sawant had a very public split with them. She wrote a whole letter about it recently, and it seems that she was frustrated that they wanted to compromise with Seattle's Democratic leaders.
Right.
So it was interesting to go there and sort of see their posters. Like one of their posters had Bezos on it, and it said Jeff Bezos on it, and it said, "Billionaires have two parties. The people need one," or something like that. It was interesting to go there and hear rhetoric that I would have probably heard at a Sawant rally, but not see Kshama Sawant.
Right. And it's one of those situations where I feel like we didn't see a lot of that protesting because it was kept further away from United Center. Would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, they did bust. Some protesters did bust through the perimeter at one point, but police presence. I mean, Chicago is used to this stuff, and in 1968 there was a much different convention that took place, another much different Democratic convention.
But there was one in between then and now where they did handle it much better in the late 90s.
Right. And they're very proud of their ability to handle these things, and there were tons of police. I can't even tell you how many police I saw. I will say, inside the DNC, those uncommitted delegates protested in a much quieter way. On Monday night, when President Biden spoke, they put their hands over their mouths, and on their hands was written "No more bombs." A lot of Democrats, or Harris Democrats, or Biden Democrats, tried to raise their signs to sort of hide those folks from view. I was taking pictures of the uncommitted delegates, and a bunch of Washington state Democrats tried to block my view with their signs that said USA and things like that. And then they wanted a Palestinian speaker when they were denied that request by the DNC. A number of delegates from Seattle and other places, including Rhode Island, Michigan, sat outside all night Wednesday night. They staged a sit-in, and I could not imagine how sleep deprived they were. I checked in on them the next morning, and some of them were, they told me they had slept on tables on the ground. One of them was taking a nap behind like a big wayfinding sign in the shade. As the sun came up, they were putting their keffiyehs over their necks to block their necks from the sun. So there was some quiet protest inside. In fact, they said it wasn't even protest, but it is protest.
Yeah. So interested to see where that piece of this goes. But there is more to talk about here, folks, and especially I wanted to talk about what is next. What's the path ahead for the Harris-Walz ticket? We haven't seen the big sit-down interviews with Harris yet. We're still a few weeks away from that planned debate with Donald Trump. So what is the game plan? Some thoughts on that, on what's next? Scott, I guess the biggest knock I've seen on the Harris campaign so far is we don't know Kamala Harris well enough. We're not hearing enough specifics on policy. We don't have any information from a big sit-down interview with a major network. We haven't seen her debate Donald Trump yet. How do you see her campaign for president unfolding? Where will she focus? Where will she not focus in the weeks ahead?
I'm a reporter, so I like to think this, but I hope that people are hungry to hear policy proposals, and particularly, where does Vice President Harris differ from the president, right? A lot of people have said, well, she's not been able to say how she differs because she's the vice president. And if you've seen Veep on HBO or know anything about
you know everything.
Exactly. Which I'm so, just a side note, I'm so sad that Julia Louis-Dreyfus, I didn't get to meet her. She was holding an event.
Oh, that would have been cool.
But, it would have been cool. I love her. Big Seinfeld person, big Veep person. But where is she going to focus? I mean, so I talked to Pramila Jayapal, our Seattle congresswoman, who was fresh off a Michigan campaign visit. It is that thing that you brought up, the complacency, right? Let's not get complacent. Let's not think that this surge in polls is going to stay or that it means we have an easy win. When I talked to Congresswoman Jayapal, she had just come from Michigan. She had been talking to folks who said they were still bringing up 2016 when Hillary Clinton didn't come to Michigan during the general election, right? And they felt that was incredibly complacent. And so what I talked to people about and what they told me is just this real sort of focus on the ground game. One of the scenes that I have stuck in my head that I need to do a story about, but I haven't had time yet, is I was walking through an event that was connected to the Democratic National Convention. It was called Dem-Palooza. Kind of not an official event, but I was walking through and there was this prefab house set up by the Progressive Turnout Project, whose president lives in Washington State. It was a prefab house where you could go up and cosplay sort of knocking on doors, but you could also act as a travel agency for folks who wanted to travel to other states. They had little brochures, Arizona, Pennsylvania, travel to other states and knock doors. So I think that Harris is really going to be focusing on that ground game and how many people can I get out to knock doors. Outside of that, I have to imagine that she's talking more about, policy proposals and thinking about that upcoming debate. I don't cover national politics, so I wish I had, more to say, but I think that is certainly when I think about what Seattleites, what Washingtonians who don't feel like they're in any jeopardy here in Washington State, but are very nervous about Harris losing, that they will go and be doing that in the next couple of months. And I've talked to some of them who plan to.
And I know that I'm going to be talking with you in the future about the impact of this race on what's happening with some of our local races too. Have only scratched the surface with you, Scott. I know that. Needed your help completing this sentence. The next 11 weeks leading up to Election Day on November 5th are going to be...
Oh, God. The next 11 weeks. Is it just 11 weeks?
I know.
All right. Frenzied.
Okay.
You have to fit essentially years of campaigning, right, into just a few weeks. Like you talked about, most people don't know very much about Kamala Harris. They are going to learn things that they don't like. Kamala Harris is going to have to make sure that they hear things that they do like. She's done an okay job of that so far. But let's just be honest. I saw Vice President Harris when she came to speak at an event, I believe, 2 years ago. She was at Lumen Field showing off some new electronic buses. And she spoke to the crowd. And that was the first time I'd ever seen her. And she is goofy. She's a little bit...
Can be.
She's just kind of a... Sometimes it's endearing, I think, for some people. And then other times it just is... It comes across as a little bit sometimes like fake, or she'll tell stories about her childhood or about meeting a child especially that are just like, I don't know if that's true. I think you're making that up. It reminds me of those tweets about, people who say their kids said Ruth Conda forever or things like that.
Sure. Right.
She has to continue this positive messaging. So far, I think a lot of people, especially young people online, have managed to take that goofiness and kind of spin it into something that is positive. And they say, well, hey, look, she's the alternative to the two old guys. So that's great. You're going to have to keep that up. And I guess frenzied, it's just going to be, so much work. I do think that, when you look at Europe, their election seasons are much shorter.
Yes.
So I wish all of our election seasons were like this, but that's just not the way America works. I know. I'm saying this as a politics reporter. What am I trying to do? Put myself out of a job? It's always election season in America, which is why Sound Politics always has something to talk about.
There we go.
Whether that's good or bad. We did an episode on this recently about how many elections we have and how big our ballots are. It's going to be fitting an entire year or more into, what did you say, 11 weeks? And yet, at the same time, every time someone tells me how close the election is, I always think, I thought it was further away. So it'll pass fast, I'm sure.
I know it will.
Hopefully.
I know it will. Well, that is Scott Greenstone, the co-host of KUOW's Sound Politics podcast. Scotty, thank you so much for being with me. Appreciate that. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, the podcast where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics and national politics, too. What do you know? Thanks again to patrons who support the show, listening to this Patrons First podcast. If you like what you're hearing, find the podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2024.